There are encounters that seem to be the result of chance, people who cross our path for a brief moment and then move on, like leaves carried by the autumn wind. But there are those who say that chance does not exist, that each encounter, however unlikely it may seem, happens exactly when it needs to happen. This is the story of one of those encounters, the story of a man who was lost without knowing, and an old woman who saw far beyond what ordinary eyes could see. The year was 1868, and the trails of Oklahoma Territory stretched endlessly under a sun that knew no mercy. They were paths of red earth and dust, walked by men who drove cattle from one corner of the country to another, sleeping under the stars and waking up before dawn to continue the endless journey. Elijah Cobb was one of those men. At 34 years old, he bore on his face the marks of a lifetime spent outdoors. His skin was tanned by the sun, his hands were calloused from work, and his faded green eyes had that distant look of someone who has seen many roads but never found what they were looking for. Elijah had been a drover for 15 years, 15 years of driving herds across endless plains, 15 years sleeping in makeshift camps, eating reheated beans and bitter coffee, 15 years of going back and forth in a cycle that seemed to have no beginning or end. It was a hard life, but it was the only one he knew. Or rather, it was the only one he allowed himself to know. That September morning, Elijah rode alone along the trail that led to Tulsa. He had just delivered a herd to Fort Smith and was returning for another. The sun was already high, the heat made the air shimmer over the land, and he had pulled his hat over his eyes to protect himself from the relentless glare. His horse, an old but reliable sorrel named Copper, kept pace. There was no rush. There was never a rush when traveling alone. Time became an elastic thing, stretching into hours that felt like days and days that felt like weeks. It was then that Elijah saw something on the side of the trail. A small, hunched figure, moving slowly in the same direction as him. From afar, it looked like just a shadow, a dark blur against the ochre immensity of the desert. But as Elijah approached, the figure gained shape and definition. It was a woman. Old, very old. So old that she seemed to have been sculpted by time itself, every wrinkle on her face telling a different story. Her hair was completely white, tied into 2 long braids that ran down her hunched back. She walked leaning on a wooden staff, each step a visible effort against age and fatigue. Their clothes were simple but well-groomed, decorated with geometric patterns that Elijah vaguely recognized from his many travels through the region. Cherokee patterns. The old woman was a native, one of many who had lived on the Oklahoma land since the government had forced them to move from the eastern mountains decades ago. Elijah slowed Copper's pace and approached slowly, not wanting to scare the old woman. The old woman stopped when she heard the horse's hooves. She turned with a slowness that spoke of tired bones and aching joints, and looked at Elijah with eyes that made him catch his breath. They were eyes as black as the darkest night, but they shone with an intensity that seemed to belong to someone much younger. Eyes that seemed to see not only what was before them, but also what was behind, inside, in the depths that most people preferred to keep hidden. Elijah touched the brim of his hat in greeting and asked if she was okay. The old woman did not respond immediately. She studied him for a long moment, those piercing eyes sweeping over his face as if she were reading a book written in a language only she knew. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle as the wind through the leaves, but firm as the rock beneath his feet. She said she was fine, just old, and that old legs didn't go as fast as they used to. Elijah asked where she was going. The old woman pointed west, toward the hills that rose on the distant horizon. He said he was returning to his people's village, which was 2 days' walk away. 2 days, on foot, under that sun, at that age. Elijah didn't need to think twice. He reached out and offered a ride. The old woman could ride on Copper's back, and he would take her wherever she needed to go. The old woman looked at him with genuine surprise. It was clear that he didn't expect that offer. White men rarely stopped to help the natives. Most people passed by, pretending not to see. Some did worse things, but Elijah wasn't most men. At least, not at that moment. The old woman accepted the offer. Elijah dismounted and helped her onto the back of the horse. She was surprising and dentally light, as if the years had consumed not only his youth, but also his physical substance, leaving only the essentials, bones, skin, and those eyes that seemed to contain universes. When Elijah remounted and got Copper moving, the old woman said something that made him freeze. She called him by name. "Elijah Cobb," she said. "You are a good man." Elijah turned around, startled. He asked her how she knew his name. He hadn't introduced himself. He hadn't said a single word about himself. The old woman just smiled. It was a smile that transformed his wrinkled face, softening the marks of time and revealing a beauty that age had not been able to completely erase. She said her name was Aita, which meant first to dance in her people's language. He said his mother gave him that name because he danced in his belly before he was even born. But he didn't explain how he knew Elijah's name. And he, for some reason he couldn't explain, didn't insist on asking. They rode in silence for some time. The sun continued its slow journey across the sky, and the trail stretched out before them like a wordless promise. Copper kept a steady pace, his hooves marking a regular beat against the hard-packed earth. It was Aita who broke the silence. She said, in that soft voice that seemed to come from far away, that Elijah was lost. Elijah almost laughed. He said he wasn't lost, that he knew that trail better than he knew the lines on his own hands. He said he was going to Tulsa, that he traveled that route several times a year, that he could walk it with his eyes closed. The old woman slowly shook her head. He said he wasn't talking about the path under the horse's hooves. I was talking about the path within him. The path he had lost a long time ago and had never been able to find again. Elijah was silent. Aita continued. He said he could see in it the mark of a man who had been running for many years, that went back and forth, but never got anywhere. Who rode aimlessly, not because he loved the road, but because he was afraid of stopping. The words hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to say that the old woman didn't know what she was talking about, that she was just a stranger he had met by chance on the trail. But he couldn't, because she was right, completely, absolutely, painfully right. Elijah had been a drover for 15 years, but I hadn't chosen this life out of love for the profession. I had chosen it because it was a way to escape, to keep moving constantly, of never sitting still long enough for the memories to catch up to him. They stopped at noon to rest and eat. Elijah had some provisions in his saddlebags, hard bread, cheese, dried meat. He shared everything with Aita, and the two ate in silence in the shade of a solitary tree that seemed to have sprouted there by miracle in the midst of so much desolation. When they finished, Aita asked Elijah if he wanted to hear a story. Stories were important to her people, she explained. They were the way they preserved who they were, where they came from, what they believed. When a people forgot their stories, they forgot themselves. Elijah said they had time. And there was something in the old woman's voice, a hypnotic cadence that made him want to listen. Aita told about her youth, over the Green Mountains where his people had lived for countless generations, in the lands that were now called Georgia and Tennessee. Over the rivers full of fish, the forests that seemed to have no end, the valleys where their ancestors were buried. And he talked about the day everything changed. She was just a girl when the soldiers came. They said the Cherokee had to leave, that the lands where they had lived for centuries now belonged to others, that they should walk west to lands they had never seen and start again. Thousands of his people made that walk. A journey of hundreds of miles through winter, without adequate supplies, without shelter, without hope. Many did not reach their destination. The path was marked by shed tears, and that is how it came to be called, the Trail of Tears. Aita survived. He was young and strong, and he was lucky. But he carried the pain of that journey for many years, the anger of being ripped from her home, the sadness of having lost everything I knew. Elijah listened silently. I didn't know what to say. What could I say in the face of pain so old and so deep? But Aita didn't tell the story to receive pity. It was supposed to teach something. She said that for many years she lived with anger, anger at the men who had stolen their land, anger at the world that had allowed that injustice. The anger was like a fire inside her, burning everything it touched. But over time, she learned something important. He learned that anger was a weight that only hurt those who carried it. That living in anger was like drinking alcohol, baby, waiting for the other to die. That the past, no matter how painful, could not be changed, but the future could still be written. She looked at Elijah with those eyes that seemed to see right through him. He said he also carried a weight that was slowly crushing him day after day, mile after mile, and asked if he wanted to tell her what it was. Elijah didn't plan to tell. I didn't tell anyone. He had buried that part of his life so deep that sometimes he could pretend it had never existed. But there was something about Aita, something that made the words come out before he could stop them. He told about Martha. Martha had been his wife, the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, with brown hair that shone in the sun and a laugh that seemed to make the whole world smile together. They had met in Missouri when Elijah was still young and full of dreams. They were married in the spring in a small but joyful ceremony, and for 3 years Elijah was the happiest man in the world. Then came the fever. It arrived without warning, like a thief in the night. Martha fell ill first, then their son, Thomas, who was just 2 years old. Elijah did everything he could. He called doctors, prayed, he begged, but nothing helped. Within a week, he had lost them both. Elijah stopped talking. His voice had cracked, and he found that his eyes were moist. I hadn't cried in 15 years, 15 years of keeping that pain locked in a dark place inside. Aita said nothing for a long moment. She just placed her old, wrinkled hand over Elijah's and let the silence speak for her. When he finally spoke, his voice was as gentle as a spring breeze. He said Elijah's pain was real and valid, that losing the one we love is the hardest thing we can face, that there was no shame in suffering and crying and feeling. But he also said that running away didn't work, that the pain was like his own shadow. No matter how fast he ran, it would always be there, right behind, waiting for the moment he stopped. The only way to free herself, she said, was to stop running, face the pain, let it pass through him like a storm passes through the valley, and then, when the storm was over, start rebuilding. Elijah asked how. How could he rebuild when everything he had loved was lost? Aida smiled that wise smile, said he wasn't as lost as he thought, that there was still life in him waiting to be lived, that there was still love in his heart waiting to be given, that there was still a future waiting to be built. But first, he needed to make a choice. They continued their journey as the sun began to set. The heat subsided, and a gentle breeze brought relief after the sweltering midday hours. Copper seemed refreshed, his steps lighter, as if the horse also sensed something important was happening. Aida told more stories as they rode, ancient legends of the Cherokee people, tales about how the world was created, about animals that helped humans, about heroes who overcame impossible challenges. Each story seemed to have a hidden lesson about courage, about perseverance, about the importance of continuing forward even when the path seems impossible. Elijah heard them all, and in each one he found pieces of himself, pieces that I had forgotten existed. As darkness began to fall, they stopped to camp. Elijah built a fire and prepared coffee. Aida sat on a rock near the flames, her face illuminated by the dancing light, her eyes reflecting the fire like two ancient mirrors. She said she had something to reveal, something Elijah needed to know before their paths parted. Elijah waited, feeling that this moment was important in a way he couldn't explain. Aida said that when she saw him that morning on the trail, she immediately knew that this meeting was not by chance. He said that sometimes spirits put people in each other's paths for a reason, and the reason for that meeting was to show Elijah something he couldn't see on his own. She said his destiny was about to change, that he would soon reach a crossroads, not just on his path, but in his life, and that the choice he made at that crossroads would determine the rest of his days. Elijah asked what choice that would be. Aida said he would know when the time came. He said the right choice was not always the easy choice, that sometimes courage meant doing exactly the opposite of what fear told you to do, and he said he had that courage within him, which he always had. I had just forgotten where I kept it. Elijah slept restlessly that night. He dreamed of Martha and Thomas, but for the first time in 15 years, the dreams weren't nightmares. They were gentle memories. Martha's laughter, Thomas's small hands holding yours, the happy days they had shared, brief but precious. When he woke up at dawn, he felt something different. The pain was still there, it always would be, but it felt lighter, more bearable, as if telling the story to Aida had lifted some of the weight he was carrying. They left at the first light of the sun. Aida was more excited, and Elijah realized that they were getting closer to her destination. The old woman pointed to rock formations and trees that she recognized, telling stories about each one, memories of decades of life in that land. Around noon, they arrived at a crossroads. A trail headed north toward Tulsa, the path Elijah knew so well. The other went west, towards the hills where the village of Aida was located. And there, on the edge of the western trail, was something that made Elijah stop. A farm. It wasn't big. Just a wooden house with a small barn next to it, surrounded by a few acres of land that looked fertile despite the dry climate. The fences were a bit saggy, the roof needed repairs, and it was clear no one had lived there for a while. But there was something about that farm that caught Elijah's attention. Something he couldn't explain. A feeling that this place was important, that I was waiting for him. Aida got off the horse, with Elijah's help. She looked at the farm, then looked at him and smiled. He said that property had been abandoned for months, that the previous owner had gone east, unable to tend the land alone, which was for sale for next to nothing, because no one wanted a farm in the middle of nowhere. Elijah asked why she was telling him this. Aida said she wasn't telling him what to do. It was just showing a possibility, a choice. He could continue on to Tulsa, find another herd, walking the same trails I had walked over the last 15 years, back and forth, until his legs couldn't take it anymore. Or I could choose something different. I could stop, put down roots, build something, stop being a man who ran and become a man who planted. Elijah looked at the farm. He looked at the trail that led to Tulsa. He looked at Aida, who was watching him with those eyes that seemed to see the future. He asked if that was what she had seen, if that was the choice he had spoken of. Aida said she couldn't see the future. Nobody could. But he said he could see the present. And in the present, I saw a good man who deserved a second chance. A man who had love to give but had forgotten how. A man who could build a wonderful life if he only had the courage to try. She walked over and took Elijah's hands in both of hers. He said life was made of choices, that each choice opened some doors and closed others, that there was no perfect path, just different paths. But he also said that some choices were more important than others, and that he would know, deep in his heart, what the right choice was for him. Then she let go of his hands and started walking towards the west. Elijah called her. He asked if he would see her again. Aita looked over her shoulder and smiled. She said that if he chose to stay, they would definitely see each other. Her village was just a few hours away, and she would love to introduce him to her people. But if he chose to go, I wished him a safe journey, and he hoped that one day he would find what he was looking for. Then she turned and walked on, her small, hunched figure gradually shrinking against the horizon, until she disappeared behind a hill. Elijah stood alone at the crossroads. In front of you, the road to Tulsa, known, safe, empty. On your left, the abandoned farm, unknown, uncertain, full of possibilities. He thought of Martha. What she would say if she could see him now. Martha had never been afraid of anything. She was the one who pushed him forward, who encouraged him to dream, who believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. What would she say? Elijah knew the answer. I knew it from the moment I saw the farm, from the moment Aita had started talking. He knew what he needed to do. Elijah Cobb got off his horse, walked to the abandoned farm's fallen fence, and for the first time in 15 years, he stopped running. The following months were the most difficult and most rewarding of his life. The farm needed a lot of work. The roof had holes that let rain in. The fences were rotten in several places. The barn smelled of abandonment and needed to be almost completely rebuilt. Elijah didn't know anything about running a farm. He was a drover, not a farmer, but he learned. He made mistakes. Lots of mistakes. Planted at the wrong time. Lost animals due to inexperience. He worked until his hands bled and his back hurt. But he didn't give up. Every time discouragement threatened to Omar says, he remembered Aita's words about courage, about choices, about the importance of continuing even when the path seems impossible. And Aita kept her promise. She appeared a few weeks after Elijah settled in, walking along the trail with her staff, as if she were just passing through, but her eyes sparkled in a way that said she knew exactly what she was doing. She brought gifts from the village, hand-woven blankets, herbs for healing and seasoning, seeds of plants that grew well in the land, and it brought something even more valuable, advice. His people had known that land for generations. They knew when to plant and when to harvest. They knew where the water ran, even in the dry months. They knew how to make the earth bear fruit instead of just dust. Aita taught Elijah all of this, patiently, generously, like a grandmother teaching a beloved grandson, and little by little, the farm began to flourish. The fences have been repaired. The roof has been repaired. The barn got new animals, and the house that had been empty and silent began to fill with life. Elijah discovered that he enjoyed waking up early and watching the sun rise over his own land. He liked working with his hands, seeing the seeds he planted turn into plants, taking care of the animals that depended on him. He discovered that he liked having a home. The years passed, and Elijah's life transformed in ways he could never have imagined at that crossroads. The farm prospered. The neighbors, who at first looked suspiciously at the drover who had decided to settle down, became friends. The Cherokee community of Aita welcomed him as one of their own, respecting him not for who he was, but for the man he was becoming. And then, 3 years after buying the farm, something unexpected happened. A woman named Catherine arrived in the region. She was a widow, had lost her husband to illness a few years earlier, and was looking for a place to start over. He had kind eyes, hard-working hands, and a quiet strength that reminded Elijah of someone. They met by chance, or maybe it wasn't chance, at the town's supply store. They started talking. They discovered they had a lot in common: the loss, the loneliness, the desire to build something new from the rubble of the past. The friendship turned into something deeper. And 2 years later, Catherine became Elijah's wife. It wasn't a love that replaced what he had felt for Martha. That love was unique, eternal, kept in a sacred place in his heart. But it was a new love, different, equally true. Elijah discovered that the human heart had room for more than one great love. That loving again was not betraying those who had left, but honoring the life that still remained. Aita went to the wedding. She was older, more stooped, but her eyes still shone with the same intensity as always. She held Elijah's hands and told him she was proud of him. He said he had made the right choice at that crossroads all those years ago. He said that Martha, wherever she was also proud. Elijah asked how she could know that. Aita just smiled and said that some things didn't need to be explained, just feelings. Elijah lived to be 79 years old. He saw his farm grow and prosper. He saw the community around him develop. He saw the friendship between his people and the people of Aita blossom in ways no one could have predicted. And when it was time to leave, he was at peace. Catherine was at his side, holding his hand. The farm he had built stretched beyond the window, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. And in his mind, he saw Aida's face, smiling that wise smile that had changed everything. In his last moments, Elijah thought about that crossroads, in the choice I had made, in the life he had built because an old Cherokee showed him something he couldn't see for himself. And he realized that Aida's revelation hadn't been about the future. It hadn't been a prophecy or a mystical vision. The revelation had been much simpler and much deeper. She had revealed to him who he really was, a good man, capable of loving, capable of building, capable of being happy. A man who had been lost in pain, but who could be found again. She had revealed that it was never too late to change, that the past did not need to define the future, that every day was a new chance to make different choices. And she had revealed the most important truth of all, that we are the authors of our own stories, that destiny is not something that happens to us, but something we create with every choice we make. Elijah Cobb had met an old woman on the trail and offered her a ride. This simple act of kindness had opened a door he didn't know existed. And through that door, he had found everything he thought he had lost to plow always. A home, a family, a purpose, one life. Not because Aida had magical powers or supernatural visions, but because she had wisdom, the wisdom to see beyond appearances, the wisdom of speaking the right words at the right time, the wisdom of showing a lost man that he could still be found. And perhaps that is the greatest magic there is, the magic of a meeting that changes everything, the magic of a word that opens doors, the magic of a choice that transforms destinies. Some will say it was luck. That was a coincidence, that it was just chance putting two people on the same path at the right time. But those who lived know the truth. Nothing happens by chance. Every meeting has a purpose. And sometimes all we need to change our destiny is a wise old woman, a crossroads, and the courage to choose a different path.